Judges is the book, covers about 350 years of history with 12 different judges throughout that period. Then we enter with Saul. He's the first king from the tribe of Benjamin. He is the one that encounters the Philistines who had come to Israel and settled in Gaza. So with David's help, they're defeated. David becomes the king after that. David's from the tribe of Judah in Bethlehem. And then he will have a son named Solomon who will build the temple that David had dreamed of building. David was denied that right. So this history is referred to in Kings. It's written in a saga style because it's pure history. The one thing I wanted to mention about Solomon, about what's interesting, is that this temple took 7 years to build, and there were 80,000 men in the quarries, led by 3,300 officers, 70,000 men hauling stones to the job sites, 30,000 men sent in rotating batches of 10,000 each to Phoenicia to cut the timber for the beams. So this was considered the highest point of Old Testament history as they see it. One other thing I want to mention about Solomon before I move on is that he engages in a lot of trade agreements and covenants with other countries, and he receives a woman every time one of those deals are made. He ends up with 600 wives. He allows those wives to practice their pagan religions and therefore falls out of favor with God. So when he dies in 925 BC, his son Rehoboam will not be able to take over all of the country because the northern 10 tribes will split from the southern 2 tribes. So that becomes a point in history that will help us refer to that later. Now, the author, as you know in this book, doesn't go chronologically. He talks in certain subject matter. And the next matter up on the book is the Septuagint, which is Greek for 70. This is a Bible that will be the Hebrew Bible will be translated into Greek around the year 300 BC. So we're moving up about 600 years pretty quick here. The story behind this Bible is simply this. When Alexander I got to do a little history for you. Alexander the Great conquers the known world. He dies after 10 years of conquering. He stops at the Indus River in India. And on his way back, he dies in Babylon. Intestate without a will. So his 5 generals will split the empire amongst themselves. The Seleucid is his name, will take over Israel, and a man named Ptolemy will take over Egypt. Now Ptolemy's grandson, now this is around the year 320 BC. So about the year 300 the grandson of Ptolemy will order a Hebrew Bible being written into Greek, because there was a lot of Hebrew people, Jewish people, living in that area. And he also wanted a Bible for the library in Alexandria that could be read by his people. So this Bible this is the first Hebrew Bible being translated into another language, which was Greek. One other interesting point historically about this Ptolemy, he was an amateur astronomer. And he came up with the idea that the earth was the center of the universe. Now, some of this is based in this passage in Joshua. When Joshua was fighting the battle, he asked God for more time, for more sunlight to finish the battle. The sun stands still. So based on that and his observations, he gave me the idea that the earth was the center of the universe, or geocentric. Aristotle buys onto this idea, and then eventually the Catholic Church does as well. Then about the year 1300, a guy named Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, realizes by observations that the sun is the center of the universe, heliocentric, and the church there's a big pushback on that, and eventually Galileo will pay the price for that idea. But that's this interesting point that Ptolemy makes. He's 2 things in history instrumental are this Greek Bible and his idea that the world was geocentric. Wow. Don't mean to wear you out on that one, but you need to try to understand that's an important aspect of history as far as the Catholic Church is concerned.
That's great.
Okay, now we got the law and the prophets. For Judaism, prophets was a catch-all term. In other words, you had the Torah and then you had everything else. You didn't really need another division. All we need to know is the Torah Everything else had to be prophesied, was prophesied. People actually went to school to learn to be a prophet. And then eventually you're going to get a third division of what's called writings. This will be Job and Daniel and some other things that are narratives as opposed to something that was necessary for their faith. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus spoke about the fulfillment of all things written down in the Old Testament concerning himself. And he mentioned three divisions: law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. Now, Luke 24:44, Jesus said, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, and that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me," meaning Jesus. However, elsewhere, Jesus mentioned two divisions, the law and the prophets. For example, in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Matthew 7:12, "Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." And then in Matthew 20:40, when he's asked what are the two greatest commandments, love the Lord God with all your heart and soul and mind, and also treat your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So you understand that Jesus is quoting the Old Testament, so he's here to fulfill what's written in the Old Testament. That's why the Old Testament is so important as a precursor to Christian for Jesus.
It's because at the time of Jesus' life or his death and resurrection, we didn't have the Gospels. And so he looked at the writings, the law, and the Psalms as the scripture that people had to resort to. That really made the case for him being the Messiah.
Right. So he was legitimately sent by God.
Exactly.
Right, to fulfill that. Now, lastly, the Greek Christian Bible, the one I mentioned previously, the Septuagint, was part of the Old Testament, and eventually the New Greek Christian Bible, which mostly New Testament is written in, will divide the books differently as history, narrative, poetic, prophetic. Poetic being Psalms or Song of Songs and things like that. So we've got dividing these books may seem kind of minuscule idea, but it's still important to understand how the Bible is divided. Now, on the next segment in the chapter is the Book of the 12. That is the number of the minor prophets, which is kind of a misnomer. It's better to say shorter prophets.
The major message
Right,
is a shorter book.
Prophets. Now, interestingly enough, Amos is actually the first prophet, even though he's considered minor. He predates Isaiah by about 100 years. He came from Judah to northern. Remember, I told you that the country had divided into two. What was Judah and Israel? He goes from Judah to Israel to warn them that they're not acting properly and God's not happy with them. Now, what he prophesied that trouble could come will come about 100 years later. And so Amos should get more credit for being than he probably is. I don't know how many of us ever study the minor prophets, but they're usually the last thing we ever get to. Yeah. I'm not going to mention all 12 of the minor prophets, but I will mention that Joel and Amos have something in common. They were writers 200 years apart, Amos being 200 years before Joel. But there's an identical verse in both of these books. And the verse goes like this: "The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up and the top of Carmel withers." So that tells me that these are God inspired. They're the same words. They're not copying. Joel didn't copy Amos. This is something he was given the same vision or words as inspiring to write. So that's kind of a clue there.
And in many ways, they also make judgments about how those who are well off treat the less fortunate.
Yeah,
and they try to boil down what it means to bring our God. So it's not just found in sacrifices, but in the way one lives their life.
Right. And the northern Israel was much more prosperous as money than Judah was. Judah was poor by larger standards. So that was the reason he was admonishing them, because they weren't taking putting God first. They were putting money first. Imagine that. So now I'm going to mention Malachi and Zechariah together. Malachi originally was included in the book of Zechariah. Now, remember, the Jews put the minor prophets basically in one book, the Hebrew book, Bible. So they don't separate them out. Where we separated Malachi from Zechariah, thereby giving us 12 instead of 11 minor prophets. And 12 always seems to be a magical number.
Holy number.
A holy number, be a better term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I prefer holy over
You're
magical.
right. Yeah, the magical. Yeah. You got to remember, I'm just a professor here. So. Now, the Gospels, Mark was written, and this is what we know. Mark was written in Rome, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew in Syria, Gospel of Luke in Asia Minor, and Gospel of John in Ephesus, which is also modern day Turkey. So these Gospels were not circulating as a collection, but individually. So people didn't have the benefit, say in Syria, of reading Matthew or the one that Mark wrote in Rome. So this makes it difficult to kind of mesh those stories together. And there's certain things in certain books that are not in other books, like Luke's narrative, birth narrative, is solely in Luke. So they weren't totally aware of how Jesus got to Bethlehem from Nazareth. So, but now the important point is that this is about collecting those books. And what happens is in the 2nd century AD, now this is the century after Christ has come to earth and has risen and and ascended. The early church fathers, we call them, will tackle this issue of what is legitimate writings about Christ. In the 2nd century, we have a lot of what they call apocryphal books being written about Jesus. And for instance, those are the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, not Judas Iscariot, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Apocalypse of Peter, and the infancy story of Thomas. I'm not going to spend time on those now, but some of those will become known as Gnostic Gospels, which I'll tackle in a later frame. So these early church fathers, as I'll call them, the early church people have to tackle the issue of, well, are these written in the same way that those are written? Are they filling in? They were looking to fill in the narrative message of Jesus' life. Remember, we don't know much about Jesus till he starts his teaching at age 30. We do have him in age 12 visiting the temple, but really what they were trying to fill in the gaps of those years with what they thought he was doing. Now, the first early church father I want to talk about is Irenaeus, and he is a bishop in the church in Lyons in France around the year 150. He believed there were just 4 gospels that were legitimate, the previous 4 I mentioned. And I'll quote him, "It is not possible that the gospels can be neither more or fewer in number based on the fact that there are 4 winds, 4 points of the compass, 4 covenants, and 4 living creatures in Revelation 4:19. The 4 covenants God made were with Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Christ. The 4 living creatures are a lion, ox, creature with a face like a man, and a flying eagle." So he said, based on that number 4, that this is it. We're told by God there's 4, and he bases it on that. The thing Irenaeus is most noted for eventually is he's the author of the Apostles' Creed. So now it's not in its it won't be in its final form for about another 100 years because they struggle over the divinity of Christ. Was he fully human? Was he fully God? So they end up kind of splitting the difference on that one. So that's sad. No, that's why his name resonates in history because of that. Our next guy up is Clement of Alexandria. And remember, these people, it's so-and-so from somewhere. Surnames don't become popular until about the 14th century in France. So everybody, unless if you're somebody, you're somebody from somewhere, but you don't have the last name. Now, Clement ushers in the era of Christian apologists. That's defenders of the faith. We don't talk about that much, but these people had to defend the faith, and based on the writings of the earlier people, that's why they're becoming interested in getting a book together. Remember, this whole idea is trying to get a book. Now, Clement Alexandria, Egypt, was a leader of a Christian school there. He compared all the Gospels, and he said the Gospel of John was more spiritual in nature than the other three, what we call the Synoptic Gospels. But he said the other three Gospels were accurate because Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things done by Christ. So we have people, learned people, giving legitimacy to books that had been written prior to their lifetime. So this is why it's important that these books get validity to be included in what we would eventually be a Bible. Now, my last early church father I'll talk about is Justin Martyr. He was a native of Palestine and moved to Rome and established a school devoted to the teaching and defense of the gospel of Christ. The perfect philosophy we learned that he seems to deliberately avoid calling individual book gospels, but saying according to Mark, got Jesus according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke. So that's how their first time. Now, the reason he also maintains that these gospels and the Pauline epistles were read alongside the Jewish scriptures with the Old Testament when Christians met in the 2nd century to celebrate the Eucharist or were having dinner together. So this idea that the fellowship and these readings taking place puts the Old Testament together with what we would become to know as part of the New Testament. Finally, a man I didn't put on the points is Eusebius of Caesarea, a 4th century church historian. He divided the books, New Testament books, into accepted and disputed. And that becomes important later because finally in the next century, they will, or later in that century, they will canonize this book. And that comes in the last chapter 5, our last chapter of the book. One more thing. He was the first to put the books in order as we know them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Originally, they were listed as Matthew and John first because they were apostles. They got the higher marks. I know, plus by the Pauline letters. These are letters written by Paul. I'm starting to collect them. Now, I mentioned I have Onesimus on here. He is a slave from a man who lived in Colossae. And Paul writes him a letter called Philemon. That's the name of the guy, Philemon. And he asking to forgive. The slave had this Onesimus had run away and been with Paul, semi-in with Paul. And he's in Rome at this time. And he writes this letter. It says, Onesimus back with a letter saying, please take him back. He is now a believer. Paul arrived in Rome around the year 60 AD. And the reason he went there is he'd been on trial in Caesarea. And he wanted to explain his position to the emperor. As he was a Roman citizen, and he wanted to see Nero about his trial and subsequent verdict. So he goes to Rome. He's put under house arrest for a couple of years, but he does write these what they call captivity letters while he's there. One being Philemon, the others Colossians, Philippians, and Ephesians. Now, Paul's intention for these letters, as the prior ones, were to be read in churches aloud. But as time went on, Paul's letters gained traction with other churches. So they made copies. They wrote copies. They didn't have a Xerox, obviously. So they write these letters and make copies of them, and they circulate. So all of a sudden, Paul's letters are, everywhere. So he's got more traction with that, and that's what his intention was for these letters. Now, whether it proliferated to the point that it did, maybe not, but he would imagine that ever happening. Now, the last person I want to talk about on this particular slide is a man named Marcion. Now, Gnostic is a Greek word meaning knowledge. The Gnostics, according to the Gnostics, they possessed a special mystical knowledge reserved for those with true understanding, and that knowledge was the secret key to salvation. So in other words, it wasn't ready for everybody. You had to have this particular knowledge. Now, one of these Gnostics, the leader of that is a guy named Marcion. He was a wealthy man who lived near the Black Sea, And he decided, I'm going to go to Rome and I'm going to make a case for a book that will certify the Gnosticism. So he goes to Rome around the year 140, and he takes the letters, takes 10 letters of Paul and the Luke gospel and makes what he considers a Bible in the sense of the word. Now, he thinks the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are not the same, because what he hates is the Jews. He doesn't want anything to do. The Christian world begins with Christ and not with Genesis. So that puts him outside the realm of where the church fathers believe. As I told you earlier, they've been reading the Old Testament along with these letters and the Gospels. And so therefore, they think that that's not right. So anyway, he is branded a heretic. A heresy becomes a major issue in the next couple hundred years. It's to the point of where people get excommunicated, and he'd be basically the first one to be excommunicated from the church. And they disregard what his wrote. He thought was just Luke and the 10 Pauline letters. More about Marcion later, why he's important to us.
Yeah, everyone's kind of jockeying to get different books in the Bible to get them,
Right.
get them approved. Some are using names of well-known people, like a pseudonym, to get it in. Then they have the pseudepigrapha, which is the false writing, something made up. And there's also a book called The Lore of the New Testament that references all the childhood stories of Jesus that were composed, and they never made it in as well because there's a certain standard, wasn't there, Marty, as far as what the collection would be?
Yeah, they for one apostolic origin, it had to come from the eyewitnesses or people who had talked to the eyewitnesses. Another thing was universal acceptance about had they been used in church. See, this is what helps those letters of Paul. They get read in church, and they get read. So along with the Gospels and along with the Old Testament. So here you are, Christians are celebrating the Eucharist, Christ, the communion with Christ, and here they are, these things are being read. So therefore they gain traction to be considered legitimate. So Paul wasn't necessarily always intended to be in the New Testament, and as it turns out, he's the major author of the New Testament. So, and without that being read, it's hard to say they would have made it. So.
Yeah.
Now, the rest of the New Testament, originally the books of what Luke wrote, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, and they considered that one book. So in other words, Luke's Gospel was Acts Volume 2. Assuming that he wrote Acts before he wrote Luke. Now, the reason for that is just simply Mark is written sometime in the late 60s, and Acts is written primarily about the same time, because that's what the Acts of Peter and Paul, and they're dead by the mid-60s. They're dead. Yeah. They've been martyred. So he probably wrote the Gospel of Luke late after he wrote Acts. That's why he gets volume 2. Yeah. For that reason. Now Luke's narrative, I mentioned earlier, Luke's narrative is this in Acts. He draws implicit parallels in the second half of Acts is an account of Paul's missions and eventual rest, which is constructed to recall the sufferings of Jesus, though it stops short of Paul's martyrdom. Like I said, in the Christian church of the 2nd and 3rd century, Luke Acts was rarely treated as a single works because the Gospels were having a higher status than the Christian books. So I wrote on my PowerPoint, I made a mistake. I said early church, Acts more important. No, early church, Luke's more important.
Yeah.
More important. So excuse me for my mistake. I didn't.
And the way we know there are 2 volumes is that Luke begins with "My dearest Theophilus."
Yes.
Lover of God or an individual.
Right.
And then Acts begins in my first volume, "Dear Theophilus," and he goes on. So there's that connection between the 2.
Thank you for that. I had it on my notes, and the pastor didn't need notes. And I missed it. It was in my notes, and I glossed right over it.
I saw your notes. That's why I missed it.
Right. Well, you have great eyesight. Wow. I got it. Okay, so now this last part is who collected the scriptures. This varies. We talk about certain times at certain places that the books become extremely important. And I'll mention two stories. one about the Old Testament, one about the New. The Jews had gone into captivity and around in the northern kingdom went into captivity in the 7th and 8th century. Then eventually the southern kingdom went in the 6th century to Babylon. Well, the Jews that had gone to Babylon were freed by Cyrus the Great, the Persian king. He sends them back with money to rebuild the temple. They're building the temple, but they're having a lot of problem with the people that are there when they went back, the foreigners, discouraging them, having problems, and men marrying foreign women. There was a lot of issues, so it stalled the whole process. So Cyrus the Great's grandson, Artaxerxes, sends Ezra back to Jerusalem with the scrolls. So Ezra, it reminds him, look, guys, we got to pay attention to God's laws. You guys are getting away from this. So they start to edit and collect the scrolls as in one book, as in one New Testament, one Old Testament. And he reads those periodically to the people to remind them of their duty. The thing that he gets in trouble with, he tells the men, you got to divorce those foreign women. That didn't go over well. And there was a lot of issues with that. So, nobody wants to tell you who you can marry and who you can't. Now, as far as the New Testament is concerned, that's the Old Testament. So we're getting now, because of the trauma they endured and maybe the possible loss of their history and their laws, Ezra comes to the rescue, and along with Nehemiah, he helps him. Now I'm going to fast forward to the year about 300. The emperor died. Remember, we're collecting all these New Testament books, but they haven't been put in the Bible yet. The emperor Diocletian orders all sacred books to be burned. So all of a sudden, oops, we got to try and hide these books or trying to get them out of the hands of the Roman officials. So the need to put a canon together became extremely important. Well, Diocletian dies, and then Constantine. Now, Diocletian put the two empires in half. There was the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Greek, one in Rome and one in Constantinople, which originally was Byzantium, but they changed the name to Constantinople. Constantine conquers. He comes out of the west and the east, and he conquers the Roman Empire back. So he puts the empire back together. Prior to that battle, he carries the cross into the battle, and he says, if I win this battle, I'm going to convert to Christianity, which he did win the battle. And his mother had already converted, and Constantine waited till his deathbed to convert to be as sinless as possible. But what that does is it makes Christianity legal, so the books are no longer, they have to be hidden, and then they work it together. And eventually later in that century, about 50 years later, the books will be brought into canonization, which simply means there'll be one set of books. Now, so that's the story on that collection part. So who collected the books? Those early church fathers collected the New Testament books, we'll call early church fathers, and then Ezra and Nehemiah probably get credit for most of the Old Testament. But there's also those intertestamental books that come along, and that's where Ptolemy comes in. The Greek Bible, he puts all those books into that book, that Christian Greek Bible. Yeah. The last part I want to say is Marcion, even though he was a heretic branded by the church, his impact is that he brought Pauline letters into vogue. He was big on Paul's letters, and therefore, because he had done that, they became very prominent, and that would be something he gets credit for.
So it would be fair to say, Marty, that it's really kind of amazing how God worked through these different events in history to bring about the canon that we have.
Right. He uses these people. He uses the people who are not Christians or even not Jewish to bring people together to get this book, to make sure that it gets in the hands of people so they understand what God's laws are. So this is our sacred book being done through humans. Yeah. Any questions?
Fascinating.
Thanks, Jane.
It's really, it's just overwhelming to me because, as I've said, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I really appreciate the way that you're delivering this, Marty, and Ed too. So
I'm just a sidekick there, Jane. I'm just putting some putty on some holes. That's all I'm doing.
But you do such a good job of it. So keep going.
All right. Thank you very much. I remember this, the book doesn't flow in the sense that we're normally reading, one thing starts before another. He goes back, the book deals with subject matter. So that's why I always the difficult about reading. And don't be discouraged. Please read, and then we'll fill in the holes that we gaps. Now,
Okay.
next week, we have chapter 4, which is From Books to Scripture. Now, this time we're going to be talking about how certain fragments of the Bible come together. There'll be various ideas about how many books should be in and which one should be in. And I'll talk about how that happens. And then how we discovered these fragments from the past, and allows us to see what happened and when it happened. Remember, we're leading up to these books, the whole Bible being one, the Old and New Testament. But this week we're going to be looking at that, how that comes together in that way. Then the last chapter, chapter 5, will be the easiest chapter before the final test. And that's the Old Testament and the New Testament, how they finally join up as one.
I just want to share with you so that you're aware. I have not gotten the book yet. We're on our 2-week countdown to get ready to pack and tie up all the loose ends here. So I'm just listening as if I were back in college listening to a lecture. So yeah, I just want you to be aware of that. And hopefully when I get down to Marco Island, I'll pick up in a more direct manner, so to speak.
Well, whenever I taught, Jane, I always assumed my students hadn't read. And most of the times they hadn't. And I never called on them as to ever embarrass them. This will never happen here.
Oh,
so
that's good to know.
Yes. So you're okay. You're good to go.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane.
And thank you, Marty. It's been great. I've been enjoying these so much.
Okay.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you next week.
See you next week.
Have a blessed day, both of you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.